Tiktuk Masoret HaMikra, Parashat Vayetze 6. Two different words in the same pasuk, which are pronounced a little unusually. First one is Im ani lo a'avor elecha et hagal hazeh ve'im ata lo ta'avor elai. I pronounce the word ani, not ani, because it's Perek, by the way, Perek Lamed Aleph pasuk nun bet. The word ani is usually written ani, hataf patach, and follow with the harik. Here it's a kamatz. Normally you have a hataf patach changed into kamatz only at the end of a sentence, sof pasuk or nachta. It goes from ani to ani. But here it's not. It's a raviyah. And it's in the middle of pasuk. Hachai comments on that. He says kamatz ba'alef. You have a kamatz in the aleph. Shelo behefsek u'mila'el. It's not with a trope that's not necessarily considered one of the major kesarim of to be a hefsek, like adachta and sof pasuk. Here it's a raviyah. So yet it still says not im ani, but im ani with the kamatz. So it's in a klal umila'el. Ani is always pronounced mila'el. Ani is mila'el. But ani, when you have a sof pasuk or adachta, mila'el. Now the word v'im ata, you have a talsha over the aleph, and yet it's pronounced, the word is pronounced as if the tam is on the tav. Ata. You don't say ata, but you say ata. Why? And he comments on this min hachai. He says the talsha, and there's only one talsha normally. He says the talsha is one of those tropes where you don't necessarily, it's always found at the beginning of the word, but you don't necessarily follow the pronunciation of that word according to that tam. You have to look for other tamim to figure out how that word is pronounced. Very seldom will you see the word ata. It's normally ata. So even if you have a talsha, that talsha does not dictate the pronunciation mila'el. The talsha is written at the beginning of the word. So you would have thought it would say ata, but we don't pronounce it like that. We pronounce it ata because the talsha is always written in the beginning of the word, and it doesn't necessarily dictate the pronunciation and the emphasis on that word. Sometimes it's correct, it's in the beginning of the word, but in this case, at the end of the word, it's still where the talsha always be written in the beginning of the word. Now he also comments, he says, in many tikkunim, in many books that he had on the Masoret, there's only one talsha that's written. Some have also put a second talsha over the tav. So you have a talsha in the beginning of the word, talsha over the tav. Why? The second tam is put there, the second talsha is put there, not because it's the original tam. The tam and talsha is always in the beginning. The second one is put there to indicate to us that we pronounce it not according to the way the tam is normally written. It's pronounced milera with the second syllable over the tav. So they put another talsha in there just to indicate, don't follow the first talsha, which is always written at the beginning of the word. Follow the emphasis on the latter syllable over the tav. So they put many tikkunim, you'll see that there's a second tav, the second talsha put over the tav. He also mentions, of course, and we see later on, that there are other ta'amim, like the zarka, and the segolta, and one might say also the peshat, the pashta, where those ta'amim are either, they're actually, in those cases, the zarka and the segolta always at the end of the word. They're pronounced, that they're written always at the end of the word on the last letter, but not necessarily pronounced. The words are not necessarily pronounced that way. For example, Mitzrayim, you have a segolta over the mem sofit, but the word is pronounced Mitzrayim, not Mitzrayim. So there's another segolta that's written there to indicate, they put two, to indicate, oh yeah, the pronunciation is mila'el, not milera, even though the segolta is always on the last letter. Same thing with the zakah, and this, he says, a reference where he mentions it extensively in the word vekacha tochelu oto in Parashat Bo, Shemot Yud Bet Yud Aleph. Then Min Hachai goes into an extensive discussion about the fact that there you have a zarka, vekacha, which is written at the end of the words, but you don't read it vekacha. We read it vekacha. So they put in the Baalei HaMasorah put in another zarka on the first kaf to indicate it's pronounced mile'el, even though the ta'am is always written mile'ra on the last letter, and the same thing with the zarka, with the segolta. The peshat or the pashta is a little different. There we find, by the way, one other that always comes at the end of the word is a tarsa, where you have the same type of description of the ta'am. Instead of a talsha, it's a tarsa. It's written the same way, but it's the tarsa is at the end of the word. But also, it doesn't dictate the pronunciation. So even though it's always written at the end of the word, it's not necessarily, the word is not necessarily pronounced on the last syllable as a milera. It may be sometimes a miler, like, for example, vayomer, many cases like that. So the other thing that he points out was the word, the ta'am pashta. Now here there's a little nuance. Pashta is always a peshat. Pashta is always that last letter of the word, and it's pronounced that way. Always when you have a pashta, milera, the word is always milera. But sometimes you'll see two pashtas. And in fact, today we call it, the Sfaradim will call it a tere kadmi. Two types of two kadmas. Two pashta, two kadmas. And when you have this two of them, the pronunciation is on the first pashta, the first peshat, the first kadma. So there, tere kadmi, you'd read it on the first pashta, the first kadma, not on the second. When you have only one kadma or one pashta, it's always on the end of the word. Excuse me. The difference is that according to the Sfaradim, we read the tere kadmi differently. Excuse me. We read the tere kadmi differently than a regular kadma. The sound is different, but with some it's the same. But with us, it's really different. So we say tere kadmi instead of kadma, but we had tere kadmi. We read it as a different ta'am. But still, the emphasis would be on tere kadmi, would be on the first kadma.